what work has LAWRS done around this and protections for migrant women in relation to the Domestic Abuse Act in general? And also, could you explain a bit about your Step Up Migrant Women campaign and the work that you've done around that?
Yes, sure. So, in the context of the protections for migrant women within the Domestic Abuse Bill and Now Act, we, alongside with Southhold Black Sisters and the End of Violence Against Women Coalition, we presented 3 different amendments to the bill, and these amendments were shaped to respond to the specific needs and particular needs of migrant women. As I said before, sadly, these amendments were not included, but some of the areas that we tried to influence to be incorporated as part of the bill had to do with access to public funds, extension of the domestic violence rule and the domestic violence, destitute domestic violence concession that was led by Southhold Black Sisters. So the second amendment was the incorporation of a non-discrimination clause led by the End Violence Against Women Coalition to comply with the Istanbul Convention and the Article 4.3. And finally, the amendment on the establishment of safe reporting mechanisms that was led by LAWRS, leading the Step Up Migrant Women campaign, that seek for the establishment of a firewall that in policy and practice created a separation between any form of immigration control from reporting a crime and accessing support. So in this context, what is the Step Up Migrant Women campaign? The Step Up Migrant Women campaign, first of all, aims to center the voices and experiences of migrant victims and survivors of VAWG to influence policy making. For instance, influencing the Domestic Abuse Bill Now Act. Currently, the campaign is supported by more than 50 organizations from different sectors: End of Violence Against Women sector, migrant sector, women sector more in general. And we seek together to improve the access to rights and justice for migrant victims of crime. And we were established in 2017. And we have been actively campaigning and advocating, as I mentioned, with the amendment for the establishment of safe reporting mechanisms in the form of a firewall to ensure that victims of crime, victims of VAWG in this specific area with insecure immigration status can report abuse to the police and other statutory services, approach other statutory services without any risk of immigration control. So I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but one of our main goals with the campaign is to give voice to those women, to those victims who have been often overlooked from decision making, and that as a result are often excluded from any forms of protection. And yeah, I think that's in general what we did. Since the beginning of this bill, that it takes us, like, I think back to 2017 when there was, like, at the beginning of all this process until when the bill was received royal assent. We were pretty active organizing with different organizations, other frontline by and for organizations, to provide evidence, but also to ensure the voices of migrant women with lived experience who are really aiming for change and aiming their experience to work as a vehicle for other women not to experience the same. We tried to open these doors, and that meant that we had victims and survivors interacting with members of parliament, with other decision makers. So I would say this is one of the main goals in terms of allowing migrant women themselves to speak about their experiences and avoid others speaking for others, and not really representing and showing the specific needs that they have and how they have been victimized by perpetrators, but also by the system, also by the state. That's what they want to show.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for doing all that incredible work and the work around the Step Up Migrant Women campaign. It's brilliant. So yeah, finally, could you both just finish by talking a bit about what more you think needs to be done, and what the sector can do, and get behind and support the cause, especially seeing as, like you said, the Domestic Abuse Act has now been passed into law?
I think there's a lot that needs to be done. I mean, we are at a crisis with migrants in this country. There is a lot that continues to disadvantage migrant survivors of domestic abuse and other forms of VAWG in the country. So the most obvious thing happening right now is the inclusion of European citizens and their dependents into this hostile environment that they were not necessarily part of before, because somehow, you know, their rights were more or less assured. But that is going to bring millions and millions of women into this situation where they're going to be more vulnerable to experiencing violence and abuse, and also more unlikely to receive support from the state. And that, in terms of scale, is a really worrying prospect. The fact that we have not been able to ensure in this country that there is secure reporting mechanisms and a firewall between statutory services, mainly but not exclusively police, and immigration enforcement, means that we will continue having women going through the cracks. And that might be coupled with potential immigration reform, where it becomes easier and easier to lose immigration status or to have an insecure immigration status and to have it for longer, which is also kind of really worrying, means that we're going to have a bigger proportion of the population who are unable to access any kind of safety, any kind of support, and definitely any kind of justice. No recourse to public funds continue to be a massive issue. And as I said, one of the effects of the EU settlement scheme is that even if you are registered and have pre-settled status, which is what you can get before you have 5 years of residence in the country, that means that more likely than not, you're going to have no recourse to public funds. And that is going to increase the proportion of women in this situation. I think there's a lot that the sector can do. There's a lot that can be done in supporting specific initiatives, campaigns, and policy positions from organizations who are by and for. And by that, I mean that even if immigration status is clearly not a protected characteristic, even if it makes you more vulnerable to situations of violence and abuse, there needs to be a lot more solidarity with migrant women, with refugee women, and with women who are not immediately obvious. I mean, the campaign that is being led by Women for Refugee Women right now on the Nationality and Borders Bill is quite key to ensuring that asylum seekers who may be escaping violence and abuse and seeking asylum in this country can be protected, and they're not going to be left in this kind of quasi-limbo that's being envisioned for them through this legislation. But we need to ensure that there is an opportunity for by and for organizations to lead on these topics that we are experts on, either by experience and also by profession, while showing the full support of the Ending Violence Against Women and the women's sector to these causes. I mean, it's very easy for decision makers and stakeholders to dismiss us because we're not seen as relevant, and we're definitely not seen as important. We're a problem to be avoided and ignored. But they can't ignore the whole sector, which is why we need to build more solidarity with campaigns like ours. I mean, we're not the only ones, but we need to build solidarity while ensuring that the people with the lived experience can continue to lead on these topics that are fundamental to them.
I think just following up with with what you mentioned at the end. I think what we need is the sector to acknowledge and really recognize the vital role of specialist by and for organizations, supporting migrant women, Black and minoritized women as well. In terms of supporting our work, supporting the campaigning work that we do, work together. That's something we did right in terms of the process of the Domestic Abuse Act, that Domestic Abuse Bill in that moment. We got support from different organizations, and this allow us to reach out to different stakeholders that we might have not had before the possibility of doing so. But I think the sector needs to really speak up against the hostile environment and actively advocate for the rights of migrant women, the rights of women with no recourse to public funds, accessibility to services in general, but not taking over the specialist work that organizations like LAWRS do, because we have this culturally and linguistically competent support service that we provide to women. We have the trust of these communities who are usually isolated, and that this fosters and increases the risk of domestic abuse and other forms of VAWG for migrant victims. So it's important the sector extends solidarity, stands in solidarity, and really opposes the hostile environment that it's really negatively impacting the lives of very vulnerable victims. And I guess just again highlight what Gisela mentioned, we are now going through the Nationality and Borders Bill, and we haven't been as active as we were with the Domestic Abuse Bill, because we are supporting Women for Refugee Women who hold the expertise. So that's the way we would like to see the sector working together, understanding and recognizing the expertise of organizations like LAWRS, and opening doors for us to go and speak about migrant women. Because I mentioned this when I explained what the Step Up Migrant Women campaign is. We don't want other organizations to speak for us. We want these organizations to help us get to the table and talk about the experiences and the evidence that we collect from the front line. So I would say that's what we need from the sector.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I really like the message of solidarity, which I think is key to what we need. So thank you both so much for joining me here today.